Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Season 2, the first episode of Season 2 of Roundtable Mindset. This is Jamie.
And I'm Malin, and I am so glad that we are back for another season, Jamie.
Finally, right? It's been months.
Well, we've had a little bit. We came back a little bit, if you remember. There was such a splash in the political world. Was it back in July, late July? And we had to come off of mute for that for just a minute. But yeah, it's been months since we've actually been in the recording studio talking to each other through the microphones. So I've been waiting for so long to get to this point. So I'm glad to be back.
I am, dare I say, super excited about this episode in particular. So
yeah, when we decided that this was going to be the episode where we come back, episode number 1, a little bit excited, a little bit nervous, but mostly I think this is going to be a fun conversation. And I know the theme for season 2 is difficult conversations. I think it would all come clear as we continue down and we go over who our guest is and what we're going to be doing in today's episode.
Yeah. Well, and, speaking of the crazy political climate, that's kind of where we're going to jump in. We promised some difficult conversations around, this, I don't know, monumental, historic, I don't know what even to call it, this crazy political cycle. And so here we are,
political
ready
whirlwind?
to have the conversation.
I don't know.
Oh my goodness, right? I don't either. But, as far as difficult conversations go, I think, I think we've talked about this a little bit in the summer episodes that we did, that we're kind of in a difficult space and making some difficult decisions. And because of that, it's important that we really take a look at our options and think about what is best for not just ourselves and our families and our communities, but also what's best for the country. And so because of that, Malin and I had the opportunity to invite the Libertarian presidential candidate, Chase Oliver, on for our podcast. So we'd like to just take a minute and visit with him and see where he's at. So are you with us, Chase?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to speaking to you and to your listening audience.
Yeah, we're pretty excited. I'm always excited about it.
I was going to say, Jamie, if she doesn't use the word excited in any sentence, it's like, really, you missed something. Okay. So Chase, one of the things that, just to kind of kick us off, I'm just a voter, right? I'm not a political narrator, or I'm not in the political scene. I don't hold any office, but I think I have one of the most important jobs in the political space, which is just being a voter. So I asked some of my friends who are also voters and tried to get them to say, hey, we have Chase Oliver coming on. He's a libertarian. And 9 times out of 10, what they were wanting to know is, well, what does the Libertarian Party stand for? What do they hold dear to themselves? So I was wondering if we could start off with, could you give us a little bit of a rundown of what does the Libertarian Party, what is the beliefs? What is the platform that represents?
So broadly speaking, the Libertarian Party is a party that believes that we want to limit government to the smallest size possible, because we believe in the principle of non-aggression. We believe that the best way for humans to prosper and flourish is to allow for each individual person to live as they see fit, so long as they're not harming another person. So my elevator pitch to our party is that, we don't believe in the government deciding these things for you. We believe that your life is your life. Your body is your body, your business is your business, and your property is your property. It is not mine, Chase Oliver's, nor yours, nor the government's, but it is your, as an individual, your right to determine what you do in your life. And if you're not harming anybody, there should be no need for government to intervene. So broadly speaking, we're a limited government party. We want to see your taxes low, your freedoms defended, and support your right to live as your authentic self in peace.
That's well, and I'll be honest, I was doing quite a bit of looking, mid-July when, I don't know, when it all kind of hit the fan and everything changed. I was looking at other options. I was, did not feel like either candidate really embodied what I was looking for. So I've done a little bit of, I don't know, TikToking and looking at your website and things like that. One of the thoughts that I had was, here's someone who's young and has some fresh ideas. And as the, I guess, resident liberal in the room, I'm more conservative than, like New York liberals. But as a Democrat, I would watch your TikTok videos, and one video I would be like, oh, no, that's a really great idea. And then the next video, I'm like, no. And so your policies and ideas like kind of go back and forth for me. How would you, I guess, what would you say to someone who's in that space that's saying, I don't know that either of these parties have the ideas that fully embrace where I'm at? How do you appeal to those voters?
So I think the first thing we recognize is that the Libertarian Party tries to not be left nor right. We try to be liberty over authority. And so there's going to be policy positions that maybe would traditionally have been defended by the right side of the political spectrum in America or the left side of the political spectrum. What I try to tell voters is that rooted at the end of the day is the idea that you can make your own decisions for yourself. And so you can be as conservative or you can be as liberal as you want to be in your own life. We just don't seek to use the power of government to try to sway one way or the other. And particularly for those maybe on the left side of the political aisle, folks like yourself who see us wanting to get rid of, social welfare programs and other things. I think the biggest thing we have to communicate is that just because we don't want the government doing something doesn't mean we don't think it should be done. We just think that, say, the way to help those who are less fortunate in our communities is to have direct and mutual aid from the community level, as opposed to putting our money through a bureaucracy where, you get taxed $1 and you get back a dime. And so, our position is not that we don't want to be helped or that we don't want to help the poor or that we don't believe that there are better ways to, or that there's social changes that we need to see in our society. We just don't believe that the government is typically the best vehicle to do those things. We believe in the free market of ideas. And so I think some things that maybe might scare some folks on the left, once you see, in action how empathic libertarians in general are, but both the message of liberty and direct and mutual aid is, might see kind of a different story being told than what they might just see based on policy prescriptions. Because just because I don't advocate the government do it doesn't mean that I'm not going to roll up my sleeves and help out my community, which I do all the time through direct and mutual aid and charity work.
So Chase, I'm going to say, I don't know if this needs to be said or not, but I feel like I just need to identify myself. So I'm the resident Republican on our podcast. And so there's a lot of times that the conversations that Jamie and I have had over the course of our podcast, I have taken more of the conservative point of view. And I will say some of the things that you're saying now and some of the things I've uncovered while doing some homework, some of the things that hit my ear very well are some of the more of the conservative points of view that I'm used to from the Republican Party. And so one of the things that come to my mind is I hear what you're saying, that it's liberties above policy. But when we talk about something that says, conservative, that most Republicans gravitate towards, I guess one of the questions I scratch my mind with is what makes your party different than the Republican Party on some of these things? And the one thing that you brought up, which I heard, which was smaller government. And I'm a big fan of smaller government. I don't think the government needs to be in all of our businesses and our things. At the same time, when I hear you speak, that's what kind of hits my ear. But then it makes me ask the question, but what is different between your party and, say, the Republican Party when we talk about some of those conservative points?
Well, because I think what contrasts me with, say, the GOP in terms of both our policy and our platform as a Libertarian Party is that there are many social issues to which the Republicans just really have not gotten there on or are slowly getting there on. LGBTQ rights is something that the Libertarian Party has supported since our founding. We've always supported the right of individuals to have equality when it comes to treatment under the law. So with regards to marriage or military service or adoption laws, we've always been ahead of the curve, even back in the 1970s, before even Democrats were on the issue. We're also radically, we want to end the drug war, which many conservatives might see as a radical position. But of course, we view the concept of addiction one that is more of a medical issue and not a criminal justice issue, that we would rather find ways to support people being able to get into a rehab bed as opposed to a prison bed. And so many of these policies, in addition to what I think is the greatest domestic issue of our time regarding immigration, I want a 21st century Ellis Island where anybody who wants to come to work needs to just come through a port of entry, be vetted and allowed to work. Well, I believe that that's in line with the history of our country and the fact that immigrants have helped build this nation up. Many Republicans might disagree with some of those policy positions, but I feel the need to say I could argue any one of them on a debate stage, and I would really welcome being on a debate stage with a Donald Trump and a Kamala Harris and being able to really hash these out in a way that is allowing for open discourse and a real good discussion of these issues. And I'm thankful that y'all have a podcast that allows for that.
Well, and I think that, that's something that we talked about in our summer special was, we kind of took a stab at chatting about the debate a little bit. And, why can't you participate in those debates? Is there, what's keeping you from doing that?
Well, up until this year, there was the Commission on Presidential Debates that was founded in the 90s. And that was a group that was basically made up of Republicans and Democrats who created artificially high polling thresholds and standards to be involved in the debate. So the standard for them was you had to be at 15% in 3 national polls. But of course, many times the Libertarians not even included in the polling, which is crazy to me. We're still not being included in many polls that folks like Cornel West are being included, who's on the ballot in about 6 states. The Libertarians going to be on the ballot in, at least 45, if not 48 or 49 states. So, we're going to be on the ballot in many more states than, say, a Cornel West, but polling firms still don't even include us. And so the idea that we can hit 15% is crazy, A, when you're not being polled, but B, when you're not even getting the share of the media there that would allow you to rise to 15%. It's kind of a self-defeating prophecy. And in reality, the last candidate who was a third-party candidate who earned over 15% of the vote on Election Day was Ross Perot. But at the time of the debates, Ross Perot, who was included in those debates in 1992, was polling at 7%. So he wasn't anywhere near that 15% threshold, but he ended up earning 19% of the vote on Election Day. And that's because many Americans got to see Ross Perot on the debate stage. And so I think we need to have a more open process. And I think the standard really should be that if you're on enough state ballots to theoretically win 270 electoral votes, you should be included on the debate stage. That would have the debate stage right now having myself and likely Jill Stein of the Green Party and Robert F. Kennedy as an independent being on the debate stage, taking the choices from 2 to 5, which I think is much more representative of the broad swath of the electorate and would serve the voters a lot better. But yeah, right now it is basically the media who is controlling the debates, both CNN and ABC, and the Democrats and Republicans. They are no longer part of the Commission on Presidential Debates. They're now independently organizing this. But of course, they have the exact same threshold that the commission did for third-party inclusion, which is why you don't see myself or Robert Kennedy or Jill Stein on a debate stage. Unfortunately, I did just do the Free and Equal debate, though, in Las Vegas at Freedom Fest, where myself, Jill Stein, and then also Randall Terry of the Constitution Party had a wonderful debate. And I wish there were more out there like that.
Well, and as you're, talking about Ross Perot, that is probably the most notable third-party candidate that I can think of in my adult awareness of politics and campaigns. And I'll be honest, most of the thought around that election specifically was that Ross Perot came in and split the Republican vote and paved the way for Bill Clinton to become president. Good for me at the time. My question for you is how do you play into this right now? Because you're not given an opportunity to share the national stage with the two of them on debates and things like that. I have watched more cable news of all kinds in the last, couple of months since the big shakeup in July, and they don't talk about independent candidates at all. And so, how do you see your role in this campaign shaking out when so much of that attention is given to the two major parties, and how do you win?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to unpack there with that question. First, there are victories beyond winning the White House that I think the Libertarian Party can stand to gain from by having a really well-run presidential campaign that brings out the number of voters that we need to earn things like ballot access and major party status that allow more libertarians to be able to run for office, and that when they do run, they have access to things like the primary ballot, debate inclusion at the state level, these kinds of things. So part of what I'm doing is helping to build up our party's foundation, hopefully to bring in new members and to bring out new voters. That's actually the largest voter pool that the libertarians typically gain from, is not self-identified Republicans or Democrats, but self-identified independents, many of whom would not vote at all if they didn't have a libertarian to vote for. And so our goal is to try to bring out as many new voters into the process as possible to have an impact. But of course, you're right. Overcoming that media hurdle is something that every independent campaign has to fight. And one of the things we've done has been as available as possible for media. We've continued to send out constant press releases. We've continued to make ourselves available to as many outlets, both in traditional media and new media. And I understand there's always going to be an uphill climb. One of the things we as third-party independent candidates have to do is learn how to do a lot with very little. So I ran for the United States Senate in 2022 in Georgia and forced the runoff in that race. Now, I'm mentioning that because it was the most expensive U.S. Senate race in history. My opponents combined spent about $250 million. And so their cost per vote, the amount of money they had to invest to get each vote out, was about $20 to $25 per vote. I spent just over $20,000. And my cost per vote was around 24 cents per vote. And so when it comes to doing a lot with limited resources, libertarians and other third parties are pretty well practiced at that. And I'm really well practiced at squeezing out every vote out of every dollar that we can.
That must take a lot of legwork to make that happen. Because I think, it's 24 cents per vote. It's not a lot of money, but these major parties have tons of money being thrown at them constantly. So they get to spend that kind of money. One of the things that's been super prevalent, I think, in some of the news sources that I've been digging into is this personality politics. And I don't want to engage in personality politics, but I do think that one of the things that is helpful for me in who I choose is knowing what kind of person I'm voting for. Can you tell us just a little bit about you as a human? What drove you to this, and why do you keep coming back? You ran for Senate and now president. So tell us a little bit about you.
So I am a 38-year-old, soon to be 39, living in Atlanta. I'm somebody who was born in Nashville, Tennessee, but mostly raised in the metro Atlanta area. I grew up in a small town called Snellville, Georgia, about 30, 40 minutes outside of Atlanta. And I was raised with the values of, I was raised in the evangelical church, but now identify as an Episcopalian. And really my faith and my values really revolve around the idea of empathy and nonviolence. And to that end, my first real entryway into activism was being an anti-war activist during the Bush war years, and being somebody who's always fought on behalf of like the little man, the guy who's being stepped on by the state, and which is why I've been so invested in things like immigration rights, criminal justice reform, and really seeking to find those who are being ignored by the government, ignored by the official channels of power. And I think that's kind of rooted in my upbringing. That's kind of the values that my mom and my dad, my grandparents installed in me growing up. But a little bit more about me personally. I was a band geek in high school. Right now I am an avid Trekkie, avid fan of professional wrestling, which is and I'm a proud member of the LGBTQ community. So I'm somebody who is proud to be an LGBTQ voice in our politics. That way younger people can see themselves represented in people who run for office. And I'm an avid fan of going to the gun range. So there's a wider range of things that I enjoy doing, but I'm just basically your standard millennial who's trying to live in this economy. I've actually had to live paycheck to paycheck. I think that's one of the things that connects me way more to the average voter than, say, a Kamala Harris or a Donald Trump or anybody who's really been involved in the political process for a long time. I actually live in the economy that our government is providing for us, and having to make my way. And so maybe that's, I think, what connects me a little bit closer to the average voter. And I'm really committed to having millennials have their voice, and of course, Gen Z as they rise up, helping them to have their voice in our politics, because the people who have been in charge in Washington, D.C. today are the people who were in charge back when I was a high school band nerd. And to me, that's kind of crazy that so much of the leadership is still around over 20 years later.
Well, for sure, band nerds unite. I'm
Yes,
both a band nerd and a Trekkie. So yes, but oh, stop it.
Oh, calm down, Jamie. Actually, I have a couple of questions to what you've been saying, Chase. And Jamie, I've never heard of the word, what did you call them, personality politics? Yeah, I've never heard of that before. So I'm sure what I'm about to say probably has some, maybe it lives in that space. I don't know. But Chase, one of the things that I like to do for myself, and I can't imagine I'm the only voter out there that kind of thinks this way, but I try to align myself with a political person who I think is going to fall in line with, my belief structures, where I think the country should be going. It's going to benefit myself, my family, my friends, my community, all those wonderful things that I kind of hear traces of those in even what you're saying. So I have a situation that I'd like to ask you, and it's very specific, and it goes back to an episode that we did probably over a year ago. And I'm a Christian, I'm a Republican, so I'm really conservative. So I had to go out on a limb with a conversation that Jamie and I had about abortion rights. And I don't want this next question to just be teed up and kind of swept under the rug as, oh, it's a typical abortion question, because I don't hear a lot of people asking this types of questions. And I heard you earlier, what your party stands for is, people's body, they have their rights, their choice. But I'm just curious, as a man, as a father, if I was in a relationship with a woman who wanted to go and exercise her rights for an abortion, what is your platform? What are you personally, what do you feel about the father's rights in those conversations?
Well, I think I've been very vocal in the past, and I am a pro-choice voter. I do believe ultimately it's a question of bodily autonomy, and that body does belong to the expectant mother. That would be, and I recognize that there is a difficult conversation we had with expectant fathers, but the reason why I think we have to side with the rights of the woman, the rights of the potential mother, to choose whether or not to have an abortion, results in the fact that there's 9 months of medical care that is needed. There's 9 months of changing your entire way of life, from everything from being able to have a glass of wine with your friends to, the physical changes that will be happening to your body as you undergo pregnancy, to the social changes, to the costs of, having to potentially raise a child. Like, these are all things that need to be considered. And while I do recognize that a potential father needs to be a voice in that conversation, and certainly if I were, not an LGBTQ person, but if I were somebody who was having this discussion, I would want to be part of it. But ultimately, we have to remember that decision has to be under the person whose body is most at risk, and who has the most medical potential for medical problems that undergo pregnancy, which is a very, very huge change to someone's body. And I think it is a momentous thing. It's something that shouldn't be entered into lightly. But I also think we can do all sorts of things to reduce the number of abortions out there. But as far as where is the father's decision making, he should certainly be involved in the conversation. He should be somebody, because it does take two to tango, so to speak. And they should be able to say, advocate that if they want to keep the child, for what they can provide and what they can do to help out with the pregnancy, for instance. But when it comes to that ultimate decision, it has to be made by the person who are themselves pregnant.
Well, and there's parts of even what you said there that I actually appreciated, which is you do nod to the fact that there's two people that created that life. And although I don't really see or agree 100% to what you said, at least you recognize that. I think that's been kind of my sticking point for the longest time is, and I'm not saying that pregnancy is easy. I mean, I've seen my wife go through 3 pregnancies, and I can attest to the difficulty that happens through, during pregnancy and after. It is a big change. But as being a father, I can't imagine almost being silenced to the point where I couldn't have my voice. Like it's almost like you can tell us your opinion, but it doesn't matter because ultimately the woman's carrying the child. So therefore it's up to the woman 100%. And I can't imagine it's only me, but that sticks with me a little bit as a little bit of unfair. And there's a whole variety of things that I don't really want to unpack in this conversation. I just wanted to kind of get your opinion on this because nobody's really talking about fathers and their rights and when the father wants to be part of the life. Because there's a whole conversation there that there's some fathers that don't want to be in the child's life. They leave the mother, whatever it is. And I understand that exists. But for the fathers that want to, it's almost like that's great. If your significant other agrees with you and listens to you, that's great. But guess what? They don't have to. And you just have to sit quietly and watch this unfold. And I guess that's what sticks with me.
So if I could just speak to that a little bit, I think, what's responsible for men to be doing in this situation is to be discussing ahead of time with their sexual partners of, do we want to have a child from this? Is this sex? Are we planning to have a family from this? And if not, we need to utilize contraception or abstinence if we're not planning to have a pregnancy here. I think that's the discussion that both partners need to have ahead of time of sex. That's part of having a responsible and healthy sexual relationship, is to understand the boundaries and the expectations that come from a sexual relationship with one another. And so I think that's where really fathers need to have that discussion is, are we trying to have a baby right now? And if we are, there's also ways to actually make that a lot easier on behalf of both parts of the couple, knowing, ovulation calendars and things like this. But that's part of having a healthy family planning discussion, which I think many times people don't really have, which is why you have accidental pregnancies, which is why I think we as parents, I certainly hope that my nephews and nieces are both fully educated on contraception, on having a healthy sexual relationship, but also not being scared to talk to their potential partners about the expectations of a relationship. I think that is something that should be engaged in responsibly with both men and women when it comes to entering into a relationship that could potentially have a pregnancy come out of this. And I think it's really important for parents to educate their kids to have that conversation when the time comes for them to have sex, when the time comes for them to grow up and want to either start a family or engage in a relationship. They really need to understand what those boundaries are. And I would encourage people who are engaging in sex to really have those conversations with your partners, to be as smart, and, to not go in blindly knowing what's going on. And I think if that were to happen, you would see more contraception use from those who don't want to engage in family, creating a family right now. And you could certainly have better resources going to helping to provide for building a family, if that's the goal.
This is one of those perfect topics where I don't want to be like blurred lines, but I'm hearing you kind of understanding both sides of that coin. My question for you would be then, should you be elected as the president of the United States, what changes would you make to current policy and law?
So in regards to abortion and choice, I do believe that this needs to be left the most local government possible, which is not your city or your town or your state. It's actually your own self-governance. And we need to defend bodily autonomy. That's something I believe is federally enshrined in the Constitution. So I would seek to pass federal legislation that would enshrine Roe and Casey, basically those statutes, into law. So saying that a woman has the right to an abortion up until the point of viability. Post viability, there needs to be health or life of the mother at risk. That would need to be signed off by a doctor for those rare instances where you would need to have an abortion post viability. But I think this would be what most Americans are at, on the policy side of things. And I think it's where most people can have their own conscience deciding this issue for themselves, as opposed to having the government issuing it one way or the other. I would also pair this with the Hyde Amendment, which would not allow for federal dollars to go into funding abortion. Now, I'm a libertarian. I don't want federal dollars funding a lot of things, but I also think in particular with something that is so difficult and there's so much contention around the ethics of it, I wouldn't want to see federal funds going to that. And I do believe that, if no federal funds went to Planned Parenthood, they would overcome that fundraising short gap very quickly, because people would pull out of their pockets and contribute themselves to those organizations as they see fit. And so, I am pro-choice. I do believe in federally enshrining that right up to the point of viability. Post-viability, there needs to be a doctor intervention, health or life of the mother. And I don't think federal funds should go to fund it one way or the other.
And that actually is one of the things that when I did read up on you a little bit, I saw that point, which I'm glad you went there because I was going to conclude with that, this conversation with that. I do find that a little bit refreshing because, in Jamie and I's conversation, as you can, imagine, when it's, off the microphone, it's just us. Sometimes it can get a little bit heated. But one of the questions that keep coming up between Jamie and I when we have this type of discussion was, it boils down to, what does it matter to you as a man, Malin? And when I took away all the moral issues I have with it or the ethical issues with it or, my Christian views, and I just boil it down, the one thing I always kept coming to is, well, federal dollars are funding this. That's my tax dollars. That automatically gives me a seat at the table to have an opinion because of the funding that's coming. It might be a fraction of a penny of my income, but still the concept is there that if federal government is funding this, federal money, some of that money, I believe, will come from my taxes. So it automatically gives me that seat at the table to have an opinion. The way I'm hearing you say, if federal government's not, funding that and it's all private or through, personal donations, that almost eliminates my seat to have an opinion other than being the actual father of a child going through that personally with my significant other. And I kind of like the idea of not having government funding that because of those reasons I just mentioned. So that was kind of one of the neat parts that I was reading up about you. So I'm glad you touched on that.
I don't think that removes your seat from the table. What I think it does is it ultimately allows that to go into the realm of, just like I said, just because I don't want government to do it doesn't mean I don't think it can be done or should be done. That just moves that funding into the realm of, okay, take your money and donate it to Planned Parenthood, $5 a month if you want to. And like I said, they would overcome any taxpayer funding that they're getting right now very quickly through fundraising. But I'm sorry, go on. I just wanted to reiterate that point there.
No, appreciate that. The other thing that I heard, since we've kind of uncorked this type of questioning, one of the things you said, and I'm going to butcher it, but so correct me where I'm wrong, is your party believes in do no harm to other people. And yet, I think I read or I heard you say about going to the gun range. So it almost seems like a contradiction, or at least one that I expect when I'm going to the political party, you're either for guns or you're against guns. And I'm kind of hearing you right in between that a little bit. So would you mind expanding on what your policies or your beliefs are around bearing arms? And, again, kind of picking off what Jamie said, if you become the next president, what kind of legislation are you going to put into place around firearms?
Yeah, so this is going to be the part that, I think maybe the abortion part might have upset the Republican side of your audience. This part's going to really upset the Democrat side of your audience. I'm actually a 2A absolutionist. I support basically, if the government can own a gun, you should be able to own a gun. I support 2A rights for all peaceful people, so long as you're not, actively, under being criminally adjudicated for a violent crime, something to that effect. You should be able to own a firearm. I do believe in opposing things like bump stock bans, pistol brace bans, suppressor bans. I'm somebody who sees the government trying to take an inch and then taking a mile with that. I oppose assault weapons bans. For me, it's not about the fact that guns are prevalent in our society. They always have been. We have been a pro-gun nation since our founding in the Second Amendment. I think the better thing to look at is not only has violent crime gone down, but we have seen the rise of mass shootings in my lifetime. And I think the better correlation there is to drive up the fact that there is a massive empathy problem with the rise of social media, the dehumanization that has existed because of that rise, as well as the prevalence of psychotropic drugs being involved to try to treat mental health illness that we see from so many of the shooters. And there's better ways to address these things. But I'm a total pro-gun guy. In fact, I have a higher gun rating from the gun owners of Maine than, say, Donald Trump does. I'm somebody who thinks the NRA is kind of actually being very cowardly in a lot of their positions because they're not full-fledged defending the Second Amendment, which I do. And I've always said that, as a gay man, armed gays are harder to bash. And I'm somebody who used to work in a bar late night, having to leave the bar at 2 a.m. with a couple $100 in tips in my pocket and have to walk 3 or 4 blocks to get to my car. And I was always glad to be armed when I was able to walk back and comfortable doing that.
This, again, you're just kind of exemplifying my experience in walking through some of your TikToks and social media posts. Like, yeah, no, I'm with you with that. And then this kind of comes along, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. And I live in a pretty conservative state. I live in the Midwest. I'm not a hunter. I've used firearms. Not my favorite thing to do. I'm not anti-gun, but you kind of spoke a little bit about the mental health crisis and things like that. I guess, it's a topic that's important to me. It's the work it's the space that I live in for my career. How would you address what I'm just going to call it a mental health crisis that we're seeing in this country, and the rise in things like mass shootings and, opioid issues and things like that. How would you address those issues around mental health and drug abuse?
So I think a couple of things we need to look at is taking some tools and putting them on the table that have been taken off the table by our government's war on drugs. I think things like psilocybin therapy, MDMA therapy, and ketamine therapies are great examples of being able to utilize substances that might be used in some people in a recreational sense for drugs, but can actually help provide real mental health breakthroughs. And that in many states, these therapies are not legal. And I would like to see that expanded to more states. Psilocybin therapy being like the most one that I've seen and had the most insight into. I've spoken to mental health professionals who say that microdosing psilocybin during talk therapy can allow for breakthroughs to happen in weeks or days instead of months, because it takes down like the psychological barrier that people put up in front of themselves. And so it allows a practiced mental health practitioner to be able to help through talk therapy to work through issues and to help achieve breakthroughs, as opposed to merely just medicating through the problem and trying to more properly identify what are the root issues and what are the root causes of mental health, as opposed to just saying, this person has anxiety, put the money into anxiety drugs. I'm not Tom Cruise here saying that there's no need for antidepressants in the world. Certainly there are people who that is utilized for them and it's helped them, right? But I do think that there are other therapies out there that are not being utilized that could better help people break through, particularly with PTSD and traumas. And then, like I said, much of the mental health problem we see is due to the rise of social media. Like that's where, if you can correlate the rise in mass shootings and school shootings with the rise in social media prevalence in our society, I don't know what the exact answer is there. I really don't. But what I see is platforms where people can get online and they can say the worst things to people that they would never say to people in polite conversation. And they do it behind an avatar, and it allows for people's mental health to be grinded down. And that's where a lot of the loneliness comes from. That's where a lot of these shooters are. They're from these online communities of very lonely men. Many times, the self-identified incel community. These are folks who really need to be having mental health issues addressed, who are not. And they are finding both misery online as well as a community of fellow people who feel that way and could reinforce their beliefs and cause their violent tendencies to bubble up. And so I don't know the exact answer to address that, other than we need to be more humane to each other and recognize that just because we're online doesn't mean we're not human.
So I've never done this before, but you touched on something even in this conversation, and I want to ask it before we leave it. So we have an upcoming episode that we are touching on school safety. And so I'm just curious, what is your stance, knowing that, you're a gun guy and you are for the Second Amendment? I have heard of and have researched there are plenty of school districts across this country that are allowing trained staff members to come to school now with firearms. I'm just curious. What's your thought on that? What's your reaction to that, Chase?
Yeah, well, ultimately, I'm a school choice guy, so I want parents to choose the school that's best for them and their student. And I think that policy might be something that parents would want to know about. I certainly am fine with having people who are trained adequately, being able to protect their students. I also think it's good to have resource staff that can help out with that, not necessarily arresting students. That's, there's a whole problem with resource staff and student, and school police, that it's a whole criminal justice ball of wax. But if there are people who are there who are able to protect students, who are well trained and can identify that, that's a standard I would like to see if I were a parent. I would like to see, what is the training procedures you go through, what qualifies you to do this. but I won't cast out the idea outright, because I do believe that there is a real vulnerability in our schools. And that's why so many people pick schools to be a place for mass violence, because they know it's where they're likely to be lightly protected. I think another thing we need to look at is the infrastructure of how we build schools and making sure we don't create weaknesses in terms of entry points that allow for better surveillance of who is coming into the school and knowing when there's a threat before it occurs. And so there's a lot of steps we can take, but I'm not going to cast that out outright. I don't think it's a bad idea necessarily, but certainly I would want parents to choose that school if that's where they want to go. And if there's a school that says, no, we're going to be a gun-free zone, and you want to send your kids there, send your kids there. You should have the right to as a parent.
Staying in that vein of education and even like school choice, I think one question I have is, school choice sounds great when you live in a large populated area. I live in a pretty rural area. So school choice means which public school would you like to go to? So how does the idea of I get to choose what school my kids go to when I have one consolidated school district of the 4 closest towns together, and that's really all there is? How do you, how do you speak to that?
So, I think if we're going to be using taxpayer funds to fund education, I am part of the fund students, not systems school of thought, where you as a parent would be allocated an individual amount of money per student to determine the school you want to go to. Now, in places with public school systems that are functioning well, you would just continue to go there. In places that have failing public schools, educational entrepreneurs are going to show up to create magnet schools, charter schools, independent schools that parents can choose to go to. And ultimately, if you say you're in a more rural district, if you have control of the funding, you as parents can directly control the curriculum of that school. You can say, hey, we have decided that we want the funding to go to this. You can organize parental like PTAs essentially to help determine where the funding should go as opposed to a school board. And it's a much better way of allocating these funds. But if you are if you're in a place that has a little bit higher population density, where you're going to see more schools popping up to compete in those areas. And ultimately, you as a parent, if you're wanting to be a homeschool parent, can have the resources to better educate your kids at home, to take the time off. If you have those allocated funds to be able to buy the school supplies your kids need. You can also do pod learning, which is one of the biggest things that I saw coming out of COVID was parents who weren't happy with like the public school through the Zoom screen. They pulled their kids out of the public school and started pod learning, where 4 or 5 families with kids around the same age basically paid for a private tutor to start teaching their kids in the home. And so it's kind of like a hybrid homeschool model. But all of these are made possible when we allow the parents and the students to determine the funding and where it's going, as opposed to a centralized school board. And again, if your schools are doing great, you'll keep sending the money to those schools. But if they're failing like they are in Atlanta, where the public schools were so bad that teachers were cheating and administrators were cheating and they got busted under RICO statutes for lying on test scores, you might want to put your money elsewhere.
Wow.
I was just going to say, I don't know if I have anything to say. I'm a huge proponent of public schools. I'm sure that's probably a given, but I guess I just look at the communities that I live and work in and how difficult that would be, because there is only one public school. So, our communities have really embraced and invested time and energy into making sure that those schools are the best they can be, because we don't have options for our kids to go in many cases. And
I think in that environment, communities would still be able to form a school together. You would still be seeing local communities and towns finding the best school and providing a great education for their kids. It just doesn't have to come through a centralized school board that can be allocated at the community level via the individual parent and investing in those schools. And that gives an individual parent a little bit more say-so in what happens at those schools. It might not work in every single community, but I think broadly speaking, creating a more free market education is going to help a lot of students who right now are trapped in really bad public schools. And again, if it's a good public school, you're just going to keep sending your money there. They already have the infrastructure. They already have the logistics and the bus routes, and they've already hired great teachers. But if you're in a place with a failing public school, you want competition to be able to either send your kids to that school or to actually create competition to drive those public schools to be better, or those existing schools that would still be existing in this fund students not system model.
as far as education goes, one of the things that we had seen on your website was that one of the things you wanted to do for education was to get rid of the what was it called?
Department of Education.
Department of Education. I keep wanting to say the National School Board or something, but that's not it. So I, as someone who is a big believer in public schools and public education and wanting those to be the best that they can, I guess how does that work? You know what I mean? Like, I'm sitting here like, how do you get rid of the Department of Education and then expect schools that are functioning the way they are? That feels like a long-term sort of thing. But on your website, it almost felt like it was day 20. You know what I mean?
Well, there's a lot of knots you'd have to untie to get that done. But there have been many people who have been coming up with the logistics to actually get that done in DC. And there's definitely roadmaps to use to removing the Department of Education. But I'd like to remind folks that, the Department of Education has only been around since the Carter administration. It is not something that was built into the United States. It's not something that was required for us to have the greatest schools in the world all through the 20th, the first half of the 20th century. It's something that, we've continued to pour more and more money into that department. We have not seen the correlating rise in educational outcomes. And so to me, I think we're continuing to put good money into a program that has shown itself to be not the most efficient way to actually allocate education dollars. And so for me, I just see us as having a need to change course here, because we can continue to fund it higher and higher and higher and still not get those correlating rises in test scores and in math and science aptitude or reading. And we're seeing other nations who are actually putting much less dollar per student investment into their school programs and seeing better outcomes. So we need to look at what is going on elsewhere that's working, but also look to what alternatives can be created now that allow for more students to have more choices in their education. And this is nothing against, by the way, I fully respect educators. I want to say thank you for being an educator. So many, and much of what I do is also to actually help the individual educator. Many of my friends got into schooling, they wanted to become a teacher because they had an awesome teacher growing up, and they want to be that awesome teacher for a student and help create critical thinkers and lifelong learners. And then they get involved in their public school, and they see the curriculum is just not up to snuff, that it's just not quality, and that they could teach it so much better if they had the freedom to do that. And so I think in addition to helping students and teachers or students and parents have a little bit more freedom to choose their education dollars, it also frees up educators to not be so stuck to a curriculum that's made up by, a county board as opposed to individual educators who are on the ground. But I am very thankful that you're a teacher. Thank you for doing what you do.
Well, we've had some really great teachers just with our kids going to them that I'd say they've changed the course of my kids' life, and they've had memorable marks on them. So there are some great educators out there. I will stop there because there's also the other side of the coin. But as I look at as I look at the time, there's one thing that I want to make sure we get to, Chase, and this is something I'm going to just speak for myself, so I'm sure Jamie can relate. But my next questions is going to be, I want to focus on the economy. As a family, I'll say a kind of midterm family. We have one child who's just getting ready to go to college. I have one in high school and one just entering middle school. So we're kind of in the middle of raising our kids. And I would say probably in the last 3.5 years, we have seen things just get harder and harder and harder. And I used this analogy before. It's true, but I've used it before where, to go and take my family even to breakfast, it's a $16 omelet. So we can't go anywhere to dinner. There's 5 of us for less than $60. And so obviously you go to the supermarket and the prices there are outrageous, and you look at gas and it's outrageous. And so this is something that I'm sure a lot of other people and most of our listeners are too. It's something we struggle with. It's getting tougher. It's getting harder. I just read an article, I think it was yesterday, that said most Americans now look at fast food as a luxury. So hearing all this, and I heard you earlier say that you live paycheck to paycheck. What would you do as president? What kind of changes would you want to implement to help kind of give relief back to the American people?
Well, I think there are 2 primary drivers to inflation. The first one being the fact that our monetary policy is out of control, that we spend trillions of dollars more of a year as a government than we take in. And when we do that, the Treasury basically prints trillions of dollars out of thin air. And that devalues every dollar that's in our wallet. That's one of the primary drivers of inflation. That's why you're feeling it so much more post 2020 than you have in previous years, because we drove up spending through the roof in the COVID years to send everybody a check and to cover the businesses and these programs. And so that drove inflation, much higher than it had been in the past. And I think it's indicative of the fact that we got to stop printing trillions of dollars out of thin air. We're nearly a $40 trillion debt. That's unsustainable. So that's the first side of the coin. The greatest driver. And the way we address that is we move or balance the budget or move towards a balanced budget. I'm somebody who wants to balance the budget, and that would require us cutting a lot of sacred cows. But in order for us to have an economy that actually functions, we have to have a government that's taking in less, or that's spending less than it's taking in, considering we've been deficit spending for 40 years now. The other driver of that inflation is the fact that giant corporate firms basically have a corner in the marketplace in our economy, because we're not really a free market. We're a cronyist capitalist market that allows for these giant corporate firms to basically buy the favor from our Congress people who write the legislation, who write the regulations, and allows them to carve out sweetheart deals for themselves, but at the expense of the small business and those who are trying to rise up and compete. And so I would seek to remove as many deductions, giveaways, carve-outs, and simplify the tax code, certainly the corporate tax code, and flatten the rate. So that way it's easier to start a small business. It's easier for that small business to compete and grow into medium-sized business, and then eventually grow into the large firms we see today, as opposed to being so top-heavy. Because while we give most of the tax breaks and giveaways and carve-outs to the large businesses and the large firms, it's actually small businesses that are still the engine of our economy that actually create the most jobs. And so I'd like to see a more level playing field for across all economic levels in terms of business. And then in terms of our spending, we just have to get it under control, because if we don't, we're going to continue to be driving up inflation through creating dollars out of thin air. And that affects everyone. And that's basically a tax increase that doesn't require legislation. It's just being done by the fact that the government's spending more than it's taking in. And I think we need to get serious about that.
I'm a pretty average person. I'm a voter, but I don't go to sleep and wake up thinking about politics, right? What I do see is that my children who graduated high school a couple of years ago are now entering this adult phase. One of them has chosen education. My other one has chosen, to work full time and just join the rest of us. And, my younger brother is a millennial, and I'm constantly hearing about how difficult it is for them to live the same or even a similar life that their parents did. Owning a home, having 2 cars, 2.5 kids and a picket fence, and how impossible that is. I guess, what would you say on the street talking to my 20-year-old or talking to my younger brother? What would you say to them when they tell you this is where we're at and it's not okay?
Well, the first thing I would say is I totally agree with them. I'm actually living that life right now. I'm almost 40. I live in a great home, but it's because I live with a roommate. I live with somebody because I certainly couldn't afford the home that I'm living in on my own. And rent is out of control. I recognize the stress that our generations are facing right now. And I think much of that is due to the fact that past generations have continued to kick the can down the road instead of actually addressing these root issues that were leading to the rise of the cost of living. This is why I oppose the continued deficit spending that we have continued to see year over year over year, as opposed to seeking to reduce deficits and get ourselves to a surplus, which is what we had in the last few years of the Clinton administration, which is when we had the largest growth of the middle class in my lifetime. I don't think those things are mutually, are unconnected from each other. I think they're very much related to one another. And so what I see, for younger people is like a continuation of these policies that have been going on since before I've been in high school, really, of just ignoring it and saying, we'll just raise the debt limit. We'll just continue to pass another continuing resolution instead of really working on a budget. It's a full dysfunction in Washington, D.C. that's been going on for an entire generation now. And what's scary to me is that young voters, like your 20-year-old, have never really grown up in a world with a functioning democracy, with a functioning legislature in the United States, where they're actually passing budgets and debating amendments from the floor, as opposed to it being a tightly controlled process by our leaders in Congress. And so what I'd say to these younger voters is, I can still remember the before times. A lot of older millennials can. And I'm seeing to get us back to some sort of normalcy, get us back to some sort of life where in our government, we're not just us or them. We're actually coming together across the aisle to fix the problems. We're actually addressing the issues, as opposed to just fundraising off the fact that problems exist, because that's what the two-party system does today. They don't really solve the problems. They just fundraise in the fact that the problems exist and blame the other people for it. And so I understand the apathy. I understand the stress, and I understand because I'm living it. What I could tell voters is that if we can just change our priorities slightly, if we can just get ourselves back in the direction of where things were or where things can be tomorrow, as opposed to just relying on the status quo and just saying that that's the best we can do, we can have a better, more prosperous future for my generation, for the next generation, certainly for Gen Z as they come up. I think millennials, Gen Xers especially, they already feel like their time has passed, that they never really got their fair share. I feel like millennials more and more are starting to feel that way. I don't want Gen Zers to feel like they couldn't have prosperity because their parents weren't doing the right thing. I think it's time for millennials to be more responsible in terms of saying, we're not going to stand for this anymore. We're going to want younger leadership, and we want a change of direction.
Yeah. Well, and I've been encouraging my own, get involved,
Please vote. Please vote, young people.
Go out and do something about it. Do something different. I think I've noticed with the I work a lot with youth also, and it just feels like almost some paralysis. Like, here we are, and what can we do? And so I appreciate that sentiment.
When they've always been told, here are your options, don't think outside the box, then you live in that world and you just resent the world rather than thinking of there's a way to go around this. Let me think of fresh ideas. I'm going to put myself in that category. I've grown up in this political landscape. I've saw my parents. I've lived in it. I'm living in it. And it has that sentiment of, here's your choices. You get two, pick one, and that's it. And really, yes, they're opposite of each other in a lot of ways, but you don't really have an opportunity to sit down there and think of fresh new ideas. What can be different? How can we change it? I know I've grown up in that, and my kids are seeing it. And it's kind of funny. My daughter, who's now coming into her own, she's looking at me and my wife, and not in a negative way, but she's like, what if I don't want to live this life? What if I don't care about having a home? What if I want to spend most of my time traveling? What happens if I don't want to have a full-time job where I have to work and she's saying all these things, not because she's lazy, because she's like, but I don't want my work to be my only thing about me. And yeah, it's different. It's just a different way of thinking.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a little anecdote that kind of goes with that is, when I was a kid, Chris Farley went on SNL and joked about how if you don't live right, you're going to live in a van down by the river. And now a lot of kids want to actually live van life, and they want to travel around and live out of a van, and they do want to live in a van down by the river. And that's actually their dream, because it allows them the freedom to travel and the freedom to live that, that kind of lifestyle that allows them to travel around. So I just thought it was funny when you were like, yeah, exactly. What if I don't want to live that life? What if I want to live something different? Well, I think Liberty should be able to afford that for you. And that's actually kind of awesome. I want people to not have to live that cookie cutter 9 to 5.
There's a lot of times I don't want to live that cookie cutter life. Really,
I feel you there, man. I feel you there.
Really quick, Chase, I do have one other question. Jamie mentioned she's in, her job is kind of in the mental health field. Mine's in IT. So I have kind of a fun question. At least I think it's fun. You look at, let's go back to small businesses for a second. Not even really small businesses. I mean, heck, look at McDonald's. Look at all these restaurants and fast food places that are looking to automate, basically reduce their overhead when it comes to employees. My parents owned a restaurant where I was growing up, and I've seen firsthand the cost of wages and all of this, and waste that employees can cause. And so we live in a world now where automation and technology is getting to the point where that can all start changing. And I think it is. So I'm curious, how do you plan on, you become president, How do you plan on embracing technology? And do you have any ideas on how you would use that going forward?
Yeah, so let me just say, I just spent 13 years in the restaurant industry. So my first job was being a dishwasher, and then I learned basically everything. I've done every position you can do in a restaurant. The one thing I wasn't really good at was bartending. I poured way too heavy, but so I understand a lot of what's going through this industry and how it's changing. I am not fearful of that, actually. I'm somebody who wants to embrace automation and embrace AI because it's going to create positive changes. I understand there are people. Anytime there's a new technology or a breakthrough or a leap forward, there are always going to be people who are fearful of it, who say this is the end of civilization as we know it. What we embrace, we change, we adapt, and we end up coming up with better outcomes. It's like, yeah, when the car came around, there wasn't much need for the horse and buggy anymore. But the car coming around, while it destroyed the horse and buggy industry, it created so much potential for so much more other, growth in other areas. Similarly, while some jobs may disappear in the restaurant or food service industry due to automation, I think what this is also going to allow us is to have a greater diversity in that space. You're going to see more restaurants of more different varieties and different types of food and different choices coming up in the marketplace because automation is going to allow for that. And I think that's going to be really cool to see. So as president, I'm somebody who doesn't want to get in the way of these things. I certainly don't want government picking the winners and losers in the automation or AI space. I want to allow us to embrace those coming technologies in a way that I think will be very beneficial to mankind. And so for me, bring it on. I like to see it. I recognize those changes to the economy are going to happen and there's going to be a shock to some industries, but ultimately it's going to create a healthier economy for us in the long run because automation equals efficiency. And the more efficiently we can use our resources, the more we can spread them out and the better they can be allocated across the spectrum to more and more people. So it'll eventually lower that cost of, when you talked about fast food being a luxury, one of the things that's going to lower that cost and allow it to not be so much of a luxury anymore is future automation. So I say embrace it.
And I love, as an IT guy, I love that the fact that you used efficiencies and all those nice buzzwords. So thank you.
That is totally your job, right? The efficiency thing.
Right. I find holes in processes and make them efficient. So when you said that, I got all the spiders tinglies. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Imagine planning a podcast with my friend Malin, who's all about efficiencies from my, yeah. So, as we're coming to a close here, what I'm curious about, and I want to tell you that, I'm seeing what you're doing and I hear what you're saying. And there really are, it's been refreshing, I guess, to hear some new ideas and to hear new ideas in an arena that doesn't feel super, I don't know, divisive or I don't know, whatever you'd want to call that. But I don't agree. I don't agree with everything you say. And that's okay too. But I guess if you were to be able to, if you could stand on that debate stage and have that closing argument and be able to appeal to a massive amount of people, what would your closing statement be?
Well, my closing statement would be that I hope voters can recognize that they shouldn't have to be limited to just two choices on the ballot, and that actually limiting ourselves to these two choices has led to the greater partisanship and polarization that we're seeing in our society and our government. It's what allows us to create, hatred with one another, people that we don't even know, who we may just disagree with on a political topic. It's what allows us to dehumanize each other in our politics, because when we're limited to two choices, it's an either or situation. And so I hope voters can look at us, determine our policies, check us out one by one. Really don't be afraid to vote outside of the two-party system and to vote your conscience, because the only way we change the system is to change the way we vote and to change the people we're voting for. If we continue to stay within the status quo, we're going to continue to get lower and lower expectations. We're going to continue to vote for the lesser of two evils, which will continue to have us having more and more evils in our society. And so I urge voters to check us out. Go to our websites, look at the public statements we've made, and look at the lives we lead and the values we hold, and determine the best choice for you. And I think if honestly that were happening, and if each and every voter could do that, I would earn a lot of votes this November, and we would see a potential sea change in the way our politics functions.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of, I guess if people want to learn more about you and your party and your politics, can you do a little self-promotion and tell us where to find it?
Absolutely. So you can find me on my website at votechaseoliver.com. That's where you're going to learn everything about the campaign, our policy positions, and what we're up to. It's also where you can join up as a volunteer or a donor supporter if you so choose. We would love to have your support and to join our team, or just stay on the mailing list to stay up to date with where we're going and what we're up to. You can also find us on all the social media platforms at Chase for Liberty. At Chase for Liberty on all the major social media platforms. And then, of course, if you want to learn more about the Libertarian Party, you can go to lp.org. That is a great place to see our party platform and our statement of principles and other such things. And I encourage folks to check those out. But yeah, votechaseoliver.com. Go there.
And we will make sure that we have links to all of those on our show notes too for you. So then the listeners, as they if they want to go and click a link, they'll be able to do that as well. I'm just going to say this, Chase. I try to be an open-minded person on a lot of things, and I really kind of came into this conversation not expecting a whole lot of I don't know, thinking from my part. And I got to say, a lot of what you've said has made me go, there are some things that I fundamentally disagree with you on, and I don't think you came on here asking for us to agree with you 100%. And what I'm surprised by, and what I'm actually pleasantly surprised by, is the fact that I'm from a Republican Party, you're from the Libertarian Party, but yet we can sit down and we can have this great conversation. And I really feel like I got a chance to know who you were as a person and kind of where your platform's at. And you've given me some things to think about. You've caused me to pause to go, okay, I may actually have another option rather than just these two candidates that I've only been focusing on. And I'm going to say, for me, I appreciate that. And I appreciate this conversation and the fact that you were able and willing to come on and kind of share those ideas with us in such a way that it allowed me to hear what you were saying. So I appreciate that. And I just wanted to say thank you.
And thank you guys for a really good conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, and, I guess just to add to that for a second, thank you for being a good example for my kids to say, hey, age isn't what's important, and party isn't what's important. And, it's standing up for what you believe in and doing something about it. And I appreciate that. The more examples like that my kids can have, the better off we are, I think. So I appreciate that too. But thanks for joining us. This has been a really cool experience for me. And I hope all of our listeners have enjoyed it. We will plan to see you back here next time around the round table. We'll see you later.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.